Well, good morning. Good morning from the Kroc Institute. My name is Erin Corcoran, and I'm the Executive Director at the Kroc Institute. And this year, I'm also serving as the Acting Director. Asher Kaufman is on leave this year, but he actually will be joining us throughout the day virtually and sends his best wishes and congratulations to Bob from Jerusalem. So we're really excited for this event today. Before we get started with the general remarks, I did want to make a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Kroc Institute's presence on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for thousands of years and continue to do so. We recognize our own place in the history and practice of colonialism and understand our responsibilities extend beyond this gesture of land acknowledgement. We must also reflect on the University of Notre Dame's past, present, and future relationship with the original stewards of this land and actively pursue ways to amend this troubled relationship. We also note that a land acknowledgement alone could be meaningless if it is not accomplished by active work to address the structural injustice and violence perpetrated against Indigenous people around the globe, both historically and currently. The Kroc Institute is committed to working to address these harms and find ways to contribute to constructive transformation through our teaching, research, and peace-building efforts. So I just want to start with just a little brief format of what to expect for today. I mean, one of the great things that we were able to come out of COVID with was this ability to use technology to reach audiences around the world. And so we've continued to sort of take advantage of those lessons that we've learned and have an opportunity to sort of make this event a global event, really, by making all of these panels available in person and through Zoom. So we have over 100 registrants for today's panel that are joining us from all over the globe, including one of our panelists, Peter Wallensteen from Sweden, who will be joining us virtually. So that's really exciting. And so just what to expect. So the first and second panels, there will be in person, and will be hybrid in this room. And then the third panel actually will be completely virtual. So you can join us through the Zoom link. And then the fourth panel, we will conclude in this auditorium, and it also will be a hybrid event. I really wanted to first take a moment to thank our staff at the Kroc Institute for all of their work in putting this day together. A lot of planning, getting people here, organizing logistics, all of the different things. So a big thanks to Lisa Gallagher, our events manager and visiting fellows manager, to Hannah Heinzeker, our director of communications, Jenna O'Brien, our communications coordinator, Tim Checkley, who's up in the booth, who's making all this audio visual possible. So just a round of applause to them for all of their great work. And it's a real honor to be able to pay tribute to Bob Johansen, who's just one of the sort of pillars of the Kroc Institute. He has been a professor here with us since 1986 and is considered one of the founding members here. And although he is an emeritus, in no way is he really retired, right? He's been very busy and continues to be very busy. And just most recently, and the purpose of this today is to sort of honor and celebrate his latest contribution to his growing number of scholarship, which is his new book, Where the Evidence Leads. And, you know, I think the other thing I also wanted to mention is that this sort of builds on Bob's sort of intellectual engagement with practitioners, scholars, students, and alumni from around the world. And this is not the first time that we've had the privilege of sort of bringing scholars, practitioner, and students and alumni together to talk about the work of Bob and celebrate his prolific achievements. He actually, about 10 years ago to date, almost, a little more than 10 years ago, we had a conference here on global governance and the future of strategic peace building. And while this conference was 10 years ago, much of what was talked about was really how to dig in and grapple with questions on the evolution of international security norms and institutions and how they could contribute more effectively to future prevention of armed conflict and nurture desirable global governance. And like I said, while this conference was over a decade ago, these questions still are vexing us today, right? And with the rise of authoritarian regimes boldly attempting to rip down institutional structures of democracy and self-determination around the world, including places like Ukraine and El Salvador. So I think there's a lot of still really important stuff that we can pull from that conference. And I just want to take a moment. So after that conference, several of the individuals who participated were inspired by the discussion and talking and engaged in actually putting together some articles to speak to that. And Dean Appleby actually brought together a series of these authors to create a collection. And these authors include John Eikenberry, Richard Falk, Mark Massoud, and Ellen Ott Marshall. And we have I'm going to ask Tim if he'll put the slide up briefly to show this online collection that's been curated and edited by Scott with the assistance of Hannah Heinzeker in honor of you, Bob, for today. And so this is these publications are live and available electronically and are open access, and I encourage you all to take a look at them. They're quite incredible. So I don't want to take up too much more time, but I just want to say this today is really about being in conversation and dialogue around this new book that Bob has written. And really he's asking questions around peace and human security, and trying to provide a new model of empirical realism. And so I could spend a lot of time talking about Bob, but I think the best way we can do honor to him is being in conversation with him, which we're going to be doing for for all of today. I'm really fortunate to turn this over. We've also been really fortunate to have our PhD students really engaged in helping prepare the conference. And so today I'm going to turn this panel over to Mahmoud Youness, who's going to moderate the first panel and help facilitate the conversation. So I'm really glad to have you all here today, and look forward to a great day of discussion and collaboration. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Is this working? I'm particularly happy to be introducing the panelists. I'll get straight to the business at hand. And our first speaker is Professor Peter Wallenstein. He's a senior professor at Uppsala University. Hello. Richard G. Starman, Senior Research Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And Professor Wallenstein will be focusing on the second chapter in Professor Johansen's book, and he will be looking at the challenge of strong leaders with little regard for international law and norms. I'll introduce the other speakers when Professor Wallenstein is done. Please.
Thank you very much, and really congratulations for putting together this amazing day for Bob and his work. It's really wonderful. I have known Bob for about 40 years, and I do remember when we together participated in one of the huge demonstrations in New York, and we were walking into the demonstration under a banner calling for peace through a world order. And we were very organized and pleasant. But next to us was another guy, very much on his own, with a big banner, peace through world anarchy. I thought that was a very nice contrast. And we happily participated to ask for the reductions of nuclear weapons. So since then, Bob and I have been in continuous contact, and I'm not surprised about what is presented in the book. It reflects so much of Bob's thinking, and I do appreciate this work very much. It is really a presentation of what Bob calls cosmopolitan nationalism, something I could share very much, but it is also a contrast to narrow nationalism, and I'll come back to that. It also talks about the enlightened self-interest, which indeed is an important matter that people can see beyond their own immediate self-interests. And he really outlines, so to say, what would be a good society. And I think we all need those kind of visions in order to be able to move forward. And of course, there is so much in the book, but I will, as Mahmoud just said, concentrate on the chapter 2, which I find really most fascinating, and which is, so to say, the theoretical basis for the whole book. And I do it, of course, by observing that in your book, Bob, you are very much concentrating on the United States. I can understand that the United States has such a particular role in the international system. And in a way, one can say that you are basically asking for a more cosmopolitan approach of the United States to international affairs. But that, of course, means that one has to be critical of US interventions. And I think you are. The United States has intervened a lot, and you emphasize a number of those problems that this has generated. But still, one cannot escape thinking that you still regard the United States as a cornerstone in any kind of peace-building architecture. So that is one of my questions, and where it would be nice to continue the discussion. So that leads not only to an objection to US intervention, but it also needs to object to the reverse, that the US would withdraw from the world. And if we want to find some theoretical basis for what President Trump was trying to do, it was really to withdraw, to leave the world and just focus on the United States and not really be concerned about the rest of the world. And I think that puts a sort of a dilemma. How much should the US be involved and how much should it not be? I have, for instance, followed the deliberations of the UN Human Rights Council. And from the moment that the United States withdraw, you can say that that council basically lost its direction. As the US was missing, it gave a lot of space for other actors. So that's my first question to Bob. Really, what form of interventionism or engagement in the global system do you anticipate that the US should have? Not being the overwhelming power, but not being a withdrawn power either, I assume. I wonder what that means in reality. Now, the second objection is on the same, or not really an objection, it is a question, it's something to debate. The second is, of course, that for me, being based in Sweden, in Europe, Northern Europe, from the airport nearby here to the airport in St. Petersburg, it's a flight of 90 minutes. And there is another challenge, the one posed and identified, so to say, with Vladimir Putin and Russian expansionism. It is in many ways the kind of nationalism that you worry about. It is, so to say, reflecting what you call narrow nationalism, or what you say is not, you say it's not a healthy nationalism. If it's not healthy, it sounds like it is a sort of sick nationalism in some way. It is definitely true when you read Putin's different statements, when you listen to him, that he has a clear nationalistic ambition, and that it is a nationalism that is really exclusive. It is only for Russians. And it is very expansionist in the sense that it will deny nationalism to others, like the Ukrainians, which he regards not having a national identity. They are, he thinks, in reality, actually Russians. It is highly self-righteous, you can say. And that seems to defend whatever he is and justify whatever he is doing. And that means he can disregard a number of those norms that are basic to the way the world has functioned since 1945, and primarily the one on territorial integrity, political sovereignty of the existing states. So I was now rereading it in the light of what has happened in Ukraine. I see that you discuss this much less than you discuss the United States. You say, in fact, fairly little about Russia or even about Putin. And I wonder, when you look back now on the world since the 24th of February 2022, do you see that there are things that one would need to discuss more, react more to, in order to be able to find a world where we can maintain those international norms that are basic to your writing and to my own thinking, and how would one be able to uphold them in this highly war-oriented world that we are experiencing right now? So those are my two rather simple questions, but I'm sure they can lead to a much larger debate. Again, thank you very much for having me participate in this. I look forward to our discussion. Back to you, Mahmoud.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Our second speaker is Professor Josefina Echeverria. I'm having difficulty with the last name, apologize for that. She's an associate professor of the practice at the University of Notre Dame. She's also the director of the Peace Accords Matrix, and PAM, the Peace Accord Matrix, will also be the focus of her questions to Professor Johansen. Please, Josefina.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Thank you so much, Professor Johansen, for being here with us today. It's really an honor to be on this panel. Unlike Peter, I didn't have the opportunity to meet you many years ago, but I'm very glad that we have spent the last couple of years here at the Kroc. I wanted to, of course, first congratulate you on your book and thank you for this contribution. I, of course, read it all. I hope this was my copy because I hope it's not from the library, otherwise I'll have to find you. But I really found it extremely interesting. It is a great, I think it's a wonderful platform also for our students as a textbook, because it really summarizes a lot of the concerns that we have seen in the past years, especially, and this is maybe, of course, my own emphasis, how to balance, the realities of insecurity on the ground with the efforts to protect, especially the civilian population, either through peace agreements or others. But for me, this was the chapter that spoke to me the most, the one about enhancing security. I found it extremely interesting, the way that you bring together of course, the interdependence of humans among ourselves and with our ecosystem. And I do think, and I want to maybe speak a little bit about that delicate balance and that kind of exercise of always understanding the challenges and the dangers itself of security. I think that Peter Wallenstein was just mentioning a lot of the wars that we're seeing today, as we have seen for the past centuries, are actually fought in the name of securing either a national identity or even a supranational identity. And I think that there is always this danger, there's always this seed of violence in security discourses and practices. And I am not sure we're going to be able to overcome that balance. So looking at the book, especially on chapter 2, you write about how do we enhance not only national security towards human security, but I think that this chapter really brings our conversation and our discussions further on security, because it speaks about challenging the object of security. So what it is to be secured. So we're not just talking about nation states and populations, we're talking about people. We're talking about people who are gendered, who are positioned, who have a history, a language, etc. We're talking about the subject of security. So how do we secure those populations? And of course, always you help us understand how security practices and policies, by definition, insecure that is said to be a threat. So naming threats cannot just be an easy exercise in political leadership. We have to be aware, at least from a peace studies perspective, what happens to those that we signal as threat. And unfortunately, in armed conflicts nowadays, we're not only speaking about armed groups, we're also speaking about very often the civilian population, that ends up being the main victims of the new wars today. And finally, the means to secure that security. If we move away from the nation state and considerations and prioritizations of national security, it also means that people themselves can provide and help in their own protection and safety. And I find in the work of the Peace Accords Matrix that we're doing in Colombia, I found I think that a very practical application of that framework, and I just wanted to share it with you because I think if I had had that framework some time ago, what we wrote would have made a little bit more sense. So I want to thank you for that clarification, at least for me personally as an author. And it's in the Colombian peace agreement, there are a lot of provisions that seek to secure former combatants, and especially in taking into consideration the gender character. So not only women, but also sexually diverse populations, and how different they need to be secure because of their gender. And we have done a lot of not only monitoring work of the Colombian peace agreement, but also really wrote about what is happening specifically in Colombia with former combatants, female ex-combatants, and also with a lot of female social leaders. One of the findings that we have is that they experience different threats to their security. So while mostly male former combatants, when they receive threats to their security, their personal security, they are threatened individually. Women's families tend to be threatened, and the quality of those threats very often involves a sexual nature. So the quality of the threats is different, and therefore those who need to be secure include their relatives and their networks. Secondly, because of the activities that they have performed now in peace building, many of them have been real leaders in, for example, helping whole communities in the south of the country eradicate illicit crops. So they are having a very visible leadership in crop substitution, in illegal crop substitution, and therefore they have been actually quite important for international politics when it comes to understanding how can we really move away from a punitive drug international war on drugs towards a more restorative and a more sustainable solution to this to the drug trafficking problem. And finally, we have also seen that they have created in different women's networks their own self-care protocols that include, for example, very sophisticated early warning systems. So I think that when I look at the second chapter and I think of the framework that you are providing us, I think it's extremely useful for practical peace building, especially in post-conflict situations. Even though, and maybe this is another question, if I may. Now that my time is up. This is another question for you. I think that how do we reconcile in particular situations like post-conflict settings where people are still under threat by all the different factors remaining of the armed conflict, how do we reconcile the protection, including or considering their gender subjectivities, with a more universal notion of human security? I still think we need to, I'm still thinking about how to reconcile both, how to be, how to recognize the importance of gender provisions and gender security within a framework of human security. Thank you very much for the time, and of course in advance for the opportunity to discuss with all of you.
Thank you, Josefina, for your remarks. Our last speaker, Professor Bina D'Costa, is a graduate of the Kroc program. So she's one of us. She's a senior fellow and associate professor of international relations, Coral Bell School of Asia Public Affairs at the Australian National University. She's currently doing work in Greece on the refugee issue, on the Turkish borders, and she will be discussing the Professor Johansen's framing of human security, humanitarian protection, especially on issues of race and prejudice in the context of the global south. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Mahmoud. Thank you, Kroc Institute friends, for this wonderful invitation to be here. Congratulations, Professor Robert Johansen. What a beautiful morning to deliberate on where the evidence leads, authored by Bob, as his students, friends, and colleagues call him. So you provide timely and critical reflections on how global affairs, in particular international relations, in the United States and globally have evolved during your career, where it is heading, where it ought to go, drawing insights from your teachings, learnings, and also unlearnings. You reflect on key scholarship and debates of both past and contemporary international relations. Bob, you outlined new research agendas and invite lively and provocative writing that opens up debates on the field as a whole, and in particular subfields and related disciplines such as security studies, peace and conflict studies, global governance, and international law. Rest assured, dear Kroc students, whose aces have been marked by Bob, that in due course, perhaps in a book review, I plan to return your favor, Bob, from 2 decades ago, and meticulously comment on your footnotes, referencing style, and so on. Just kidding, of course. Now you identify and detail 7 challenges for grand strategy, and your framing begins by acknowledging the power-maximizing tendencies of great power, but you also pay attention to culture, human freedom, human rights, and human survival. Bob, I really loved that you beautifully anchored all of these to human dignity that is essential for all. I could hear your voice in my head while I was reading the book. I did read it cover to cover and have many questions, but I'm just going to ask one today. Now, this is about your constant reference to US citizens and policymakers throughout the book. What does it mean to be a citizen? While citizenship, at least through theoretical lens, confers membership, values, identity, and rights to participation, and assumes a body of common political knowledge, many of us from Global South who work and who just cross borders all the time, and now hard for us many to return to the land where we were born. What does it mean actually to think about this kind of citizenship? In my research, I've articulated how states, for example, in South and Southeast Asia, they become the basis for constructing a collective identity, which may be rigorously enforced through schooling, policing, or mass media. Bob, in the US context, if we consider stateless people, based on the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey data, the Center for Migration Studies in New York estimates, and this is a 2017 data, that there are 198,000 non-US citizens among the US resident population who fits his profiles of potentially stateless persons or those potentially at risk of statelessness. OHCHR, the UN's human rights body, considers this figure to be 217,000 as of 2021. Globally, this number is much higher. Another example of this exclusion and this othering within and beyond the state, particularly if we look at the practices of exclusionary politics in the United States, it comes with a very strong racial component of white power supremacy. Indeed, Black feminists and people of color in the US provided a very vibrant and critical contribution that focused on race, gender, and security, in particular historical contexts, drawing on race, class, and culture. In your book, you make this point about states' obligation to people very clear, but I wondered how communities and people who fall outside the category or different categories of citizenship also have a role, do they have a role in this ambitious vision of this global grand strategy? How do we pull it apart, disrupt the hierarchy and privilege of citizenship discourse, and make it well informed by the roles played by practitioners and activists on the ground. How do we teach US citizens to look beyond the lens of US citizenship? The second point here is also about telling stories of the nation. Who belongs, who is not loyal, and who are our heroes, be it in the context of non-violence campaigns or war stories. I was waiting for your reference to Gandhi and Abdul Ghaffar Khan. I don't know if you remember our numerous arguments. I did find them. Where are the women there? As feminist scholars argue that the predominant story of the nation becomes that of sovereignty, assuming a coincidence of authority, territory, population, and identity, and it ascribes primary loyalty through citizenship to the state. This territorializing logic and this disciplinary power of the state, you talk about this beautifully in the chapters, chapter 4, 5, 6, and 9 in particular. So your answer to my question about US citizenship, for example, in chapter 4, you draw, I quote, cultivating a more inclusive perspective requires sustained leadership. So you emphasize a lot on that. In chapter 5, quote, transformative institutional practices. And in chapter 6, you pull it all together with a more cosmopolitan sense of citizenship, where you say that it need not exclude territoriality-based citizenship, but it could also build on the value of human dignity and the correlates of peace and human security applied in a rich diversity of cultural settings. Only a democratic citizenship that does not close itself off in a particular fashion can pave the way for a world citizenship, quote closed. I found this really beautiful. But I also think, for example, in global South states, where I see a lot of authoritarianism at the moment happening. For example, Bangladesh, where I come from, enforced disappearance and torture and extrajudicial killings. So what are the responsibilities of these states in this kind of in this grand vision of empirical realism and the new form of global citizenship? In a far from perfect world, in a world full of suffering and violence, I know that many of us who are doing peace and security studies and international relations, in the discipline needs to constantly reinvent itself to remain both relevant and respond to the challenges of the time. The pandemic and the last few years of unpredictability and inexplicability in global politics have demonstrated the lack of political purchase and explanatory potential of our theories. I loved your theoretical framework of empirical realism. It is time really to invert the gaze further and look at the world from how you talk about empirical realism and microprisms from the experience of people that matter. Not international relations telling the stories of people, perhaps people everywhere defining the disciplinary contours and telling the stories through which we can build a world of empathy, care, compassion, and dialogue, of everything, Bob, you embody. We have many, many challenges ahead, but your brilliant book offers the best toolbox to draw from. With this, I feel like we are equipped and we are ready. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This is rather sophisticated for being just one question. I would like to ask Professor Johansen to come to the podium. We'll have a few minutes for his remarks on the three panelists, and then I'll open the floor. If anyone has any questions, we'll have hopefully 15 minutes or 20 minutes maybe for your questions. Please.
It is good to be here among familiar colleagues and also the great possibility of new friends. I want this day not to be a focus on the author of this book, but instead on how we together can help develop a more effective strategy for peace and human security. Every person in the room can contribute to that, and I want your contributions to blossom forth. The contribution of this book, if there is one, is that it invites us to consider the possibility that by maximizing the influence of the correlates of peace, which include things like reciprocity, equity, rule of law, human security, democratic governance from local to global. If we maximize the influence of those factors, which I call correlates of peace, we actually will end up with more security than if we continue the traditional sort of grand strategy, which is the maximization of military power. And that's true especially for the US, which of course is the world's greatest military power in the sense of having the most advanced equipment for destruction. But it's true of other states and other decision makers who also are focused more on the maximization of military power than on serving human needs. And so that's what I want us to focus on. How can we do that together? Now, one of these panelists here is a former student. After you listen to her, you understand why, no matter how feeble my efforts at teaching, I couldn't fail as a teacher because I had students like Bina. And I have learned so much from students over the years. They've contributed so much to my thinking. Now, I have to say, I have great questions here from all three of the panelists, and I will try to address them, although I must keep my eye on the clock because I want to have audience participation here. You know, I don't have all the answers. In fact, I have very few answers. If this book has any merit, it's because I've just tried to clear away the underbrush of negative conditioning that we have received growing up in a nation-state system that usually encourages us to give special sort of exclusionary appreciation to our own group, whether it's an ethnicity or a nationality, or maybe it's primarily religious, and to consider others not quite as worthy. That's a huge problem. And if you want an answer to all the questions that have been raised by the panelists, from Peter through Bina, it is that we have to move away from that. Now, I'm sure they agree with that. Question is, how do we do it? Just very quickly, on Peter's question, I have to say, I focused a lot of this on the US because the US is such an influential major actor. Also, it's where I have citizenship. And I was always uncomfortable about this in working with students because I was a US citizen and the US was the source, not of all problems, but of course of many. And it was an example of what I didn't like, which was focus always on military preparedness as the most important foreign policy consideration. So what do we do when we have leaders like Vladimir Putin, who seem so clearly to violate most of the norms in international affairs that I would like to see respected? First thing I want to do is point out Vladimir Putin is a product of the existing international system and the political realist way of doing international relations. He was born and grew up in the Cold War and trained to be a KGB agent. Political realists said, expand NATO to the east after Gorbachev dismantled the Soviet Union. And the US had no strategic rivals of equivalency at all. And George Kennan, the architect of US containment policy against Soviet Union, warned, and you ought to read it. Actually, I think I cited it in the book. George Kennan wrote in the New York Times, "Do not expand NATO eastward, or it will help inflame Russian nationalism. And if you do that, democracy is likely to suffer and may disappear in Russia, and you will have leadership that will be ultra-nationalistic." And that's exactly what we got. Point here is there was an opportunity for the United States to head a different direction when it had no strategic rival that could threaten its interests in any military way, and we didn't take it. And the reason we didn't take it was because of the dominance of political realist thinking in decision makers, not just in the US, but around the world. Now, Gorbachev escaped that. I don't have time to go into that. But how do I deal with that problem? I just think the recommendations of this book are even more imperative, not less so. What these events have done is make it more difficult to see how we can implement the recommendations, but they do nothing to suggest those recommendations aren't absolutely necessary. We've got to get out of this kind of adversarial way of thinking, this mindset that brings people like Putin to power and makes the likelihood of attacking another country much more likely. There would have been another way. We could have gotten Russian troops. We could have approached Russian worries about Ukraine, I think, in a way that would have been similar to how we dealt with Russian soldiers occupying Austria after World War II. In return for the Russian soldiers leaving, Austria was made a neutral country. And that may have not been exactly what the Ukrainians wanted, but it probably would have been better than the destruction they're having now. So the main problem in international relations is how to deal with the great leader who is violating the norms. And the only thing to do in the long run on this score is try to enforce law on individuals. That's, of course, what the International Criminal Court tries to do. Far from successful, but yet it's first time in world history we've had a permanent judicial institution that can try individuals for crimes. So it's there, just isn't being used. And sadly, the United States hasn't become a member. And again, it's because of political realist resistance to trying to institutionalize war prevention and the maintaining of peace. If I reflect for a moment, I can see I'm tempted to be a professor and give a lecture. So let me depart from that and try to move to another question. I think the very practical suggestions, questions and suggestions that you made about peace building on the local level are excellent suggestions, and how to reconcile those local needs with a kind of universal human rights. Again, I think there's no simple answer to that. But I hope it becomes clear my idea for the future is that people need to participate in decisions that affect their lives at every level of society. So what is proposed is an effort to have social movement organizations or local groups mobilized in order to express ideas that can influence decisions within their own country and throughout the country at large. And so what we need for that is to employ the best mechanisms we have for representing people who have interests, all people do, represent those interests in a very authentic way without being alienated from the political structure because it's insensitive or non-responsive. If the institutions don't respond, of course, you get populism and you get other kinds of problems. So we need to improve the system of representation so people can express their views and influence the kind of universal human rights that hopefully can be institutionalized in international law more effectively in the future. For Bina's question about who are U.S. citizens, I, of course, agree with her questions and the analysis that she poses. And my feeling is that we need to treat people as important agencies. All people, whether they're stateless people or not, they're still people. I think Martha Nussbaum someplace defines cosmopolitanism as the ability to recognize humanity wherever it exists. If we can recognize humanity wherever it exists, we've taken the first step toward having a global system of greater human security. And so we need ways to register their views. Social media can help them register their views, perhaps, but we also know social media can wreck democratic systems because of ability to amplify untruths. How do we teach U.S. citizens, Bina asks? Great question. I don't know the answer, or I would have been more successful as a teacher. But I have a partial answer. One thing that helped me learn about how to deal with intractable problems was to listen to people from other parts of the world who had other views about them, or people who could express directly their view of the problem, how they themselves have been affected by it. So a good part of the answer of how to teach U.S. citizens is to get them to listen more carefully to other points of view than their own. I agree very much with Amartya Sen's ideas about the capability approach to human freedom. Human beings actually receive freedom when they're able to have a greater chance to fulfill their own capabilities. I think that can be a guideline for how we approach people, regardless of the country in which they may hold citizenship. I think empirical realism, because it strives to be empirical, always sort of has its ear to the ground. It always wants to be listening to what individuals say who are affected by the issues as they arise. So that, if it succeeds, could be one of the positive elements in that way of thinking. Sorry to take so long, but thank you. These are good questions.
We have 12 minutes. We should cram into these 12 minutes, 15 minutes of audience questions, 9 minutes of final thoughts from panelists, and 5 minutes remarks from the moderator. I can't warp time, but I'll do away with my 5 minutes. And I open the floor to questions and see how much time is left for the panelists at the end to comment.
We are going to start with an online question from Zoom.
Okay, so we've got a question from Reynaldo Hernandez, who said, in World War II, Denmark responded to the Nazi aggression not with military means, but through non-cooperation and nonviolent resistance. Do you think that approach might have worked in Ukraine? Why or why not? I don't know who wants to take that. Broad question.
Yeah, can we ask people to address questions to specific people, or otherwise one of the panelists thinks that they are ready and willing to answer it, might volunteer?
No one?
Peter, maybe this goes into your territory.
Thank you. There has actually been quite a lot of such civil resistance, and you can say that that's really underpins all the things that they are doing in Ukraine. And when you listen to the President Zelensky every evening, that's basically what he's encouraging all the time, this kind of civilian resistance. So you can say it is there and is, so to say, combined with the military. And I think that's really an interesting situation to learn more from.
Another question. Do we have any more questions from Zoom? No? Audience?
Hello, thank you. Is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
Just to follow up on this last question, what are the nonviolent civil resistance strategies in this war? And one is also, I think, to address the Russian army and to encourage the soldiers there to reflect upon the mission they've been asked to undertake, which is a violation of international law, and they know, despite all the propaganda, the horrors of this mission. So we just saw a story in the Times this week of a soldier from Russia who has defected and is talking about how he couldn't continue in good conscience in this war. So I just remind us to keep in mind that strategy of resistance, to try to encourage Russians to think about the mission they have and to defect, resist in whatever way they can. So, yeah.
Anyone wants to comment on this remark? Should we take like 3 questions and then? Yeah, okay. Please.
Hi. In my time at the Kroc Institute, I was always connecting the global with the local. And in all of your comments about militarization and how we're solving problems internationally made me think of the past couple years in the United States, where there has been across class lines, across race lines, across gender lines, across lines of sexual orientation, a re-examination of the role of police in society, questioning whether they do in fact make people safer, whether they are causing more problems in terms of violence, and whether they're the wrong solution to a problem, whether it's better solved by mental health services, higher wages, all sorts of issues. And so my question on that, when Bob asked the question, how do we teach people in the US, is there an opening to connect this re-examination of policing in the US to the global stage?
We'll take one more question if anyone has. Otherwise, I think Bina is well set to respond to this last comment, right?
Take more questions first? Or?
I don't see any hands. Is it Professor Mahmoud, right? Please.
Thanks so much. My question is around, it's really primarily directed to Bob, but any of the panelists might wish to speak to this as well, because you're all involved in education yourselves, and that is the extent to which this book, or we as scholars of peace studies, should be speaking to, or are speaking to, policymakers. I think it's very clear, Bob, in this book, you are speaking directly to policymakers, as people pointed out, especially in the United States. But political realism is really a project of international relations scholarship. To what extent should we also be speaking to political theorists of international relations, scholars of international relations, as part of moving from international security to human security? Is that something that ought to be more overt in the strategies that we do to bring peace studies sort of more broadly to communities through our through who we address our work to which audiences? Is it policymakers, or to what extent should it be scholars?
I'll make one remark on Professor Courtwright's question, and then allow the 3 panelists and Professor Johansen perhaps to make final remarks. I think opening the possibility of speaking to the enemy is also something that is needed in US internal politics, given the way people alienate each other and castigate each other in absolute terms. And I think this would connect to the questions on the police and gender, and make us think of internal and foreign policy, perhaps using the same terms. I'll start in the same order of the speakers, ask them to make their final comments, and perhaps we can conclude with Professor Johansen making final thoughts, giving final thoughts. Professor Wallenstein.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Bob, for those comments. And I really appreciated your statement that Putin is a product of the present international system. I think that's a quite fruitful way to see what is going on here, and it highlights many of the points that you have mentioned. So thanks for your response, and also for bringing in Amartya Sen's view on freedom and capacity as a very important aspect. I like the question about the police too. I think that is something we in peace research has really not studied as much as we should. How is the police actually operating? And in the United States, it's obvious. I mean, you have 17,000 different police forces with very lousy training in many cases. But it's not only a matter of their training, it's also the kind of operations they do, the doctrines they have, and how they connect also to what is going on in schools, in social affairs, and in other communities. And I think that's really a topic that we should see more closely at from a peace research perspective. In a sense, it's a structure of violence, so to say, that we have left untouched to a large extent. So I take that as a good challenge for the future. And on the final question there, of course, we have to address the scholars. That's the basics for what makes our work credible. It is that it is seen as good by other researchers. And that gives a platform also to address policymakers and civil society organizations, so that they know what we are presenting is really solid stuff. I think we are, and your book, Bob, really highlights that how much we have accomplished, but there is still quite a lot more to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that it's one of the things that we know when you're not part of, or, you know, for subjects that have been kind of like, I wouldn't say necessarily excluded, but marginalized, is that there is a constant self-reflection about one's own subjectivity in the world and how we engage with others. And I think that tradition of being, or believed to be a sovereign power and an important superpower around the world, is that that self-reflection is left on the side. And so I find, you know, as a woman, as an immigrant, as a Colombian, having lived as a migrant in Europe for many years, I think that we just learned to understand the importance of decentering the concern of security, and of course securing the very subjectivity of sovereign political identities. And so I believe that if you are not from the US, if you don't come from this tradition of thought, questioning the role of the police in your own country and in relation to violent practices of racism, poverty, and marginalization seems very natural. So I would just echo what Professor Johansen was saying before. Of course, once you go into a classroom, an international classroom, you would say, of course, it is part of, I would say, an active citizenship. And I don't mean it in the sense of owning a passport, but being a citizen of the world and taking responsibility for all the privileges that we also have. And I think that, of course, this implies speaking in very clear terms with international scholars of international relations, and not only with policymakers. You know, we tend to, or at least for me it's very clear that there has to be an ethical commitment for peace and conflict studies, which is we cannot lose sight that we have, that we serve others, and that our work has to at least try to contribute to improving the well-being of others. In this school and at this university and the work that I do, of course, if I have to prioritize and sequence where I lay my focus, it has to be in the communities that are suffering the most. So I believe that this engagement with the world and this opening and understanding of, for example, the violence that is legitimized in the name of security, I think is an ethical commitment that for me is not only with the policymakers and is not only with scholarship, but is above all a commitment with people on the ground that are hoping that our work here really is felt in their everyday lives, that we're able to write about self-care protocols and tell people in the, policymakers in the US, these women are doing your job. They're helping you eradicate coca plantations. They are subjects of security, and therefore they should be protected. So I think we also have the role of not only giving advice, but also highlighting, let's say, populations that you would think are marginalized and who are playing a very vital role, not only locally, but also for international and global security.
Okay, so we are now playing in extra time, and we'll conclude with Bina D'Costa and Robert Johansen.
Okay. Bob, you are welcome to stop me if I go for a long time, like you've done before, 2 decades ago. So in terms of Amy's brilliant question about the re-examination of policing, here is obviously sometimes we see some, things that are visible in public discourse, and sometimes those are actually pushed under the rug or talked about in close contexts. In my experience as a UN staff member, I've seen how the United States policymakers and bureaucrats sometimes can stop any sort of re-examination of what's happening within the United States. Bob have written in the book about ICC and ICJ and all the politics about that. And in 2016, the whole global compact on migration and the United States pulling out of the migration compact, that was again very similar kind of way. The silencing worked there. On the other hand, obviously the United States is always very vocal and uses its sort of political might in countries where it sees police using extreme force. One example is in Bangladesh. Biden administration 4 months ago signed and stopped the Rapid Action Battalion, which sends forces to the peacekeeping. Some of them, they've named 6 military officials and senior police that they are not allowed to come to the United States. By that one circular, United States government in the last 4 months have stopped 180 cases of extrajudicial killings, because that's the data from local human rights agencies that every month 40 people at least disappear. So it's very interesting the kind of role it plays, the US. The second question is also very interesting in terms of political realism and international relations, how it plays a central role. It does. But those of us who work outside the US and teach outside the US, engage in other parts of the world, for example, in the Asia Pacific, we advocate, meaning by here we is a collective way, they're talking about many different people who are in no ways homogeneous, that margins are also thriving and powerful places of the discipline. And ISA, for example, offers interesting caucus and spaces, Global South Caucus, the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies Caucus, and other spaces where actually scholars who don't feel that the mainstream IR is offering enough kind of critical intervention and critical lens to think about issues, we could do that. But again, we know that on the ground, issues get very, very messy. Really, after reading Bob's book, I was thinking over the last 6 months that we have no hope in the world. When you do field work in really conflict zones, you feel, what's going on everywhere? There's no compassion for people. But as Bob is talking about that humanity and thinking about and identifying that, and that deep listening, I think is very important. within the discipline, as educators, we should do it and write about it, and also beyond. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have the?
I can be very brief because the other panelists have given good answers with which I agree to many of the questions. I'd only like to add one thing on the policing question. It's true that throughout the world there is really not a very good understanding of what good community-based policing can be, should be. So there's a lot to learn in every country of the world about that. And it's important to recognize also, on the other hand, on the other side at least of this issue, that we're asking too much of our police. We're asking them to essentially enforce the contours of a society that may in itself be very unjust. So if you want to make police less likely to use violence and draconian methods to keep order, try to build a good society. They need a good society in which to make law, by that I mean a just society in which they can make law more desirable for everybody to follow it. Then to Mark's question about do we need to focus not only on governments but on scholars, I agree with Peter, yes, of course we do. We need to focus on all aspects of society. We need all hands on deck at this time in world history, because we need to talk also to local people who don't see themselves as having much political agency. We need to inform them that their lives aren't as free and happy as they might be if we had better global governance. Huge resources are lost now in order to reinforce the idea, if you want peace, prepare for war. And we need to spend as much for preparing for peace. And so people at every level of society need to be instructed about that. And one very interesting thing to me is when we think, as Marcus encouraged us to, about how scholars are an important actor here. You know, after the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hans Morgenthau, the architect of political realism and a hugely influential intellectual leader for political realism, moved to the point of saying, we've got to make major changes. And he became a sort of nuclear one-worlder. He said the state, because of nuclear power, the state can no longer do what it was mainly designed to do, which is provide security for its own people. It can certainly respond to overwhelm any attacker, but it can't actually protect the lives of its own people without having more international governance over that aspect, at least, of military power. Most of his many followers abandoned him when he made that point. And this shows the power of this mindset and this way of thinking, that the only way to have peace is to prepare for war. So there's a lot of work to be done among scholars. I want to thank the panelists very much and the people in the audience for this very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all.